That is the voice of experience.
Yeah, good hand. Oh, no, right. Yeah. Welcome, everybody, to this panel on publishers and platforms strategies for 2019 and going forward. My name is Rasmus Nielsen. I'm director of the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism, and I'll be chairing this conversation where we have a wide range of different experiences in terms of people who are thinking about how to use platforms for their own advantage in terms of the publisher that they work for and the editorial ambitions that they have. I'll just say a few things to set this up, and then I think the focus here should be not necessarily always so much on the history, if you will, the travails that we've faced that are very real for publishers and journalists around the world, but a bit more about sort of what do we do next? What are actionable things? And I suppose that my definition of success for this panel is if people who leave the room at the end of this conversation have one or two ideas of something that they want to do or do differently when they return to their newsroom. So just the background, I suppose, is I think we need to confront as people who are journalists or care about journalism that we are a very small part of a very large media ecosystem now. So when you look at data, for example, from ComScore in the US, all of news and information on the web accounts for about 3% of the time that people spend with digital media. 3%. And that's been stable since ComScore started tracking this in the late 90s and early 2000s. So that's a fairly stable share of attention. So when we hear Mark Zuckerberg say that whatever news means to that man is going to be 4% rather than 5% of the news feed going forward, that's actually slightly more than the share of attention that users voluntarily of their own volition give to news and information on the open web. And it suggests that, again, I think we need to confront as a fact that while we are incredibly important and very proud, and rightly so, of the work that we do, we are a relatively small part of a very large open web, and we are a relatively small part, a significant part, but a relatively small part collectively of very large platform companies. And we can see citizens voting with their feet in terms of how they prefer to access news and information. So we do a survey every year at the Reuters Institute where we ask people a range of different questions, but one of them is after we've asked people for sort of a range of different ways in which they access news and information online, we ask them to identify what's the main way in which you get news online. And last year, across 28 countries all over the world, we had less than a third saying that going direct to the website or app of a news publisher was their main way of getting news online. 2/3 use various forms of distributed discovery, primarily search and social. And when we look at younger people, it's 3/4 who rely primarily on various forms of platform discovery, and in some markets far more. I'm just back from India, where amongst English language internet users in India, it's more than 80% say that platforms like search and social is their main way of accessing news. So of course publishers have been confronting this challenge, right? This threat. There's a huge opportunity to reach people, but also this threat that you're becoming reliant on other companies' channels to reach the audience, and ultimately with that reliance comes a loss of editorial control, loss of access to data, challenges around monetization that are very real. And we see these platform companies dominating the digital advertising market as they offer advertisers what I think we can say is a fairly irresistible combination of very, very cheap, targeted advertising instantly at scale. And if we look at where news publishers are trying to sell subscriptions and advertise their subscriptions, I think we can see that they too have come to the conclusion that this is kind of an attractive proposition if you're an advertiser trying to shift product. So just as audiences are voting with their feet, we see advertisers voting with their feet and embracing the platform companies. I think we also see, and this is where things get very tricky, I think we see publishers, even as they are very concerned, both about the current state of play, but also where we are heading with this highly asymmetrical codependence or symbiosis, is that publishers too are embracing the platforms. That they are using all sorts of different platform products and services to offer up their journalism and try to reach new audiences, whether it's social, messaging applications, video sharing sites, or the like. And it goes even deeper than that. When you look at the websites of news publishers across Europe, after GDPR, we tracked more than 200 major news sites across Europe, in terms of what's the content that actually loads when you access that site. 96% of them load third-party content from Google, in addition to first-party content from the publisher itself. 70% of them load third-party content from Facebook. These are share buttons, these are ad networks, these are all sorts of things that we've voluntarily integrated into our own websites in our attempt to reach and serve audiences. So publishers too are not simply reliant on platforms for traffic, but also integrating the platform products around advertising and many other things into their own products. And I think this is not just a state of play where we are today. We can also look towards the future and say, well, this contentious and fraught relationship and these issues around editorial control, around access to data, around opportunities of monetization and the distribution of rewards is going to be a defining feature of our media environment going forward, not just because of where we are today, but also because of what is coming. If we think about voice, that's another frontier that's enabled by platforms where publishers are thinking about what is our role, where do we go in, what do we bet on, what do we invest in, how do we make this work for our advantage to serve our readers, our audiences, our users. The "our" there is probably not the term I should use. But also new initiatives elsewhere, right? Apple News Plus, a new initiative in this space, so collaborations around subscription with both Facebook and Google for a number of publishers. And we see also now new initiatives being floated, at least as ideas, of this idea of sort of an additional news tab on Big Blue that Mark Zuckerberg floated in a conversation with Matthias Döpfner just last week. So I think the question now is, given where we are and given that we know this is going to be a defining feature of our media system for years to come, what have we learned from these struggles over editorial control, over data, and over money from the past? What do we think about the situation we are in now? And perhaps most importantly, certainly most importantly, what do we do next? That was the easy part. That was setting it up. The hard part is actually answering that. And I think we will see a wide range of different answers here. And that is, I think, the only right way to address these questions. There is not one answer and not one road for this. So we have a wide range of different experiences and people with different roles. I'll go through the panel and turn to each of you to give your own perspective on where do you think we should go next and what you feel we've learned. And then we'll take a few things back and forth here before we open up for questions and comments from the floor. I'll start with Janine Gibson, who according to the program is a journalist, which is a fine thing to be. I think we can be more specific now and congratulate you on your new role as special project editor at the Financial Times. Janine, you can speak to your current view or your past experience or anything really that you want. We want to hear you from you.
I won't be speaking for the Financial Times as I am not starting there for a month and Renée knows everything about it and I know nothing. But I have previously worked at The Guardian for quite a long time and at BuzzFeed. And I think probably those two organisations, as much as any, worked with the platforms, have been probably the greatest collaborators really in terms of will and cooperation and desire to collaborate with and partner with the platforms and be of the web rather than on it. The Guardian in its transition from newspaper to website and BuzzFeed obviously born out of social and very much the spirit of sharing. I see it very much as three phases, and I think we are now in the third phase. The first phase being when newspapers largely put themselves on the internet, very much as basically a printed page put on the internet, and tried to host their own sense of conversation with their readers and their discussion, and to basically integrate slowly over time social into their own platform, and then very slowly gave up on that and realized that the internet was open and that they should be part of it and they must make their articles shareable, and that people were going to have the conversation off platform, but you wanted them to be consuming their content, your content while you were doing it. And that second phase was a real struggle for most news organizations, the instinct to have your carefully curated product where you set the rules, where you set the order, where it's your gaff and your language and your discussion around your media was very, very strong, and it was very reluctantly broken down. We used to all sit on these panels and say, we must engage with the web. And I think a lot of people got burned. I think we gave up our data. We gave up a lot of the premium monetization around that move, whilst thinking we were all doing the right things and opening up our content to a democratic, better way of being. And I think it's really important to understand that and look at it properly and see it very clear-eyed as we go into this next phase. Because even your digital natives, such as BuzzFeed or Vice or Vox or Mashable or Mike, or pick your slightly troubled digital native, they will probably, at 2 o'clock in the morning, look round at you and go, we did everything they asked. We did everything right. We experimented with Facebook Live. We put everything super distributed. When you said everything was video, we all pivoted to video. When you said, let's have a picture with every tweet in order to make it more sharp, we did that. Then we did Twitter cards. Then we had a unit doing every possible thing. And we all adapted our journalism and found new ways of telling stories. And I know everybody's looking at each other and I kind of, yeah, we did. Yeah, we did. Yeah, we were at 3 o'clock in the morning going, oh, now we're doing it for Instagram. Great. All right. We've all tried it, and it's been, we can't all moan. It's been creative and stimulating, and what better way to sort of think about what a story is than to work out how to translate it into 4 GIFs and a headline. I'm not joking, it's great. But it hasn't necessarily made for the most sustainable businesses in the world. I think we can all agree that. And so now we are on the cusp of this third phase that where a whole bunch of new things have arrived, Apple News Plus you referred to, even as the most expensive journalism is slightly retreating behind paywalls, behind harder and harder subscriptions, behind thicker and thicker velvet ropes. And I think this is going to be quite the challenge for us to remember both that adapting our content to new distribution methods is challenging and creative and good for us, that it doesn't necessarily help us pay the bills. I think some of the bigger news organisations will be very reluctant to get involved in some of these new initiatives. I heard Mark Thompson speaking recently about Apple News Plus, and the New York Times is looking at Apple News Plus and going, nope, you're right. And I can see why they're thinking that. I can see why they're thinking, well, I think we'll just go back to a bit of phase 1 plus, really. It's we would like to own our own gaff, but we will make sure that you can sort of see us on social, and we might let you sample a few things. So I suppose my answer to your question, what next, is a much more cautious and measured and knowing relationship with the platforms, a bit like we ran into the relationship, it went a bit bad, and we're not really sure whether we're getting back together. It's like when you have to start dating again after a breakup. Rasmus doesn't know what I'm talking about, but you do.
I'm going steady. Thanks, Janine.
He's never had to do that.
Blathnaid, you are director of the CNN Digital International with the responsibility for EMEA, and I suppose just not to set up a contrast against the FT or other organizations that operate a paywall, in some ways, some broadcasters, you may not feel you're there, are still operating on a model where the revenues come from legacy, and it can still operate in that sort of phase 2 that Janine describes, of sort of pushing very aggressively across all different channels to build a very large digital audience and not worry too much about monetization. But you, of course, also see where this is heading in the future, and I'm sure your television audience, like every other television audience, is very, very, very old, and probably not the audience you want in the future. So how do you think about that from where you're sitting?
I mean, if I just might first pick up on the what next bit for a moment, just to kind of throw a couple of other things into it. I mean, I think when we say, what do we do next? I mean, the we is the important bit, isn't it? In the sense that we certainly can't be seen as one group of people deciding to do one thing next. Your relationship with social platforms is very different if you're a public service broadcaster, for example, and your remit is to, to meet the audience where it is. That's entirely different again than to if you are, a small and digital publisher, and maybe the majority of your audience is going to be hopefully found through another distribution platform. And then again, it's entirely different to if you're a company like CNN, where you have very strong owned and operated platforms. So for us right now, the priority and the focus absolutely is on our own platforms. And those being our mobile web, our app, our desktop, they are the platforms that are in our control. They are the ones that we can monetize. But we recognize obviously the fact that we are also at the same time trying to grow those audiences. We're not standing still. So in order to do that, we certainly have to engage with other platforms, and we do that. I think we're at this point on more than 30 different platforms, be they everything from the voice-activated scale of things through to messaging services and social networks. And the engagement then that we have with the platforms is done in a very specific way, constantly being looked at and evaluated, measured, and then what we do from that is integrate the stuff that's working and move away from the stuff that isn't. So recently around obviously the area that I work across is thinking about how do we grow the CNN footprint across the world, and we've experimented a lot recently with being very intentional about how we target using our Facebook audience, how we're geo-targeting, making sure that it's matching. It's not just a large Facebook audience, and we've got a very large Facebook audience of millions and millions of people, but using that large Facebook audience then to really look for the audience that we're looking for. So growing our markets in India and Singapore and other sort of territories that are important to us, and that has moved the dial by being intentional in that way, and focusing. And then I think, for us it's, and for really everyone, you really do need to, and I think what Janine says, you need to know your place in all of this, right? And your place in the relationship that you have with all of these platforms. These are not media companies. They've gone out of their way to tell us that, and if you didn't hear that, then you haven't been listening. And so I think that, you've got to bear that in mind, that you can build and base your business models on your own platforms. You can't base business models on other people's platforms. They have their own objectives and KPIs and all of those things. So if you're too closely linked to that, it's going to be a real challenge. But when we think about how we engage with platforms, we're thinking about, in terms of, are they going to assist in terms of bringing that referral traffic back to our owned and operated platforms? Is there a revenue play involved with that? And as I said before, I think it's certainly from our position, you've got to be ready to make the U-turn, as in you can be engaged with something, but then, you can evaluate it and not be engaged. And again, you shift the focus back to your owned and operated platforms. The final thing I would say is that, the other part, obviously, of platforms is they have reshaped, and I think the stat is fascinating, and, it's always a good one to give us a sense of perspective that 3% of internet use is news, and bears repeating frequently, and, as I certainly take my commute into work on the tube, all I see are people playing games, and they're not reading the news necessarily. So that's what we're in a fight against, right, to get some more attention. But one of the sort of the things that I think is to be embraced is we need to look at how these platforms have changed how we consume the internet. Learn more from how they've done it, right? Learn more from how they make their platforms really sticky. So make sure that you're finding some of your inspiration for the frameworks that you use among the most sort of successful elements of some of these social platforms, and the gestures, the behaviors, all of these things. So find your inspiration in places like Instagram stories, which we've done in terms of bringing some of those frameworks and sort of storytelling techniques back to our own platforms. We made a whole interactive that was inspired by Tinder, but it was all about the US presidential election. So I think it's looking at the platforms and finding some of that sort of behavior that is interesting and is working out there, and try and bring that back home to your own platforms, and sort of learn from their experimenting. I mean, they're all, one platform is learning from another platform in terms of the big socials, so we should be also keeping an eye on that and trying to bring them onto our own platforms.
Thanks, Blathnaid. Maria, you sit as Director of Strategy at eldiario.es, which is somewhat different from CNN, and somewhat different from Financial Times, and also quite different from BuzzFeed. How have you tried to work these platforms to your advantage from what you're doing?
Yeah, in fact, I think one of the issues that it's important to consider is that relationship with platforms are really also dependent on where you are, in which country you're working, and even in my personal experience, I've seen a big gap between working in the US and working in Spain. In the case of the US, was also for a large news outlet, Univision. In 2016, I was one of those doing Facebook Lives all the time. And Univision was actually paid to do those. So there was an economic interest there, a business interest. And beyond that, the relationship with the platforms was quite intense. Even when they realized there were some problems, they lobby a lot, large news outlets, but also they show some interest in trying to do something for niche outlets or smaller outlets. When they started this trust project, they considered the large news outlets, but also smaller ones as ProPublica or maybe specialized ones. In the case of Spain, actually, in particular, Facebook has been very slow in just trying to build a relationship with news outlets in general, and really in the case of El Diario, which is a medium-sized outlet for Spain, it's been quite non-existent. In the case of Facebook, Google maybe is another story. I still believe they have improved in general in the last months. In Spain, we have a snap election coming at the end of this month. And for instance, Facebook has organized a project to fight against disinformation, misinformation, that is in the first steps, but seems to be working. In fact, the person of Maldita, who is the project that is participating in this effort in Spain, is here, so maybe you can talk to her later. And it seems to be working. So even though maybe relationship with publishers are not so intense as in other countries, I think there's some improvement. And also, especially when maybe you are not the focus of platforms so much, you realize that you also have your own responsibility to do things. And we're always asking for transparency in the case of Facebook and Instagram and Google, but maybe we can start also working on our own. One of the things that they could do is share more metadata about when this website was created, where all these things that we're saying, we can also do that. And in fact, I really like the idea from The Guardian that we have seen in the last few days, that they started like showing very prominently the date of publication of an article, like in the headline, in yellow. You could really see if there's a story that maybe is 4 years old, which is important, or a few months old. And you don't need Facebook or Twitter for you to do that. So I think we should start also to do things on our own while still pushing for more platforms, more transparency, more trying to reward not polarizing or not clicky content. We can still do that, but I think there is also things that we could definitely do. And what I noticed also is that maybe we are less dependent on some of these platforms in terms of traffic. Especially because loyal readers tend not to go through them so much, and maybe something also changed in the way they're showing statistics now. So we need them, but maybe we need them a bit less than a few years ago.
Before I turn to Renée, just maybe a quick follow-up. I'd be curious. Some people use the term platform darlings for these sort of the large, international, recognized, often very prestigious upmarket brands that are always amongst the launch partners and always invited to be amongst the launch partners. But not everyone works for an organization like that, especially this is an international conference after all, or an international festival. I'm just curious about your experience of moving from Univision and moving to Spain. Is there a world in which not being courted all the time by geeks bearing gifts is a good thing? if you don't have someone every week, we have this new thing, it's going to be amazing, you'll miss it, you know, you're regretted if you miss out. The fear of missing out is not only about us as end users, it also works with publishers. Is there an advantage sometimes with a bit of distance?
Yeah, it could. I mean, we spend a lot of time at Univision, like a lot of resources in video, the live Facebooks and Facebook Lives. And well, some of that was okay, but maybe some was not that useful. And in the case of El Diario, for instance, I've been there for a few months, but they never really invest in promoting content because they didn't have so much money maybe, but they didn't really try that, and also the kind of stories that we do, that's mostly politics, business, so they never really invest a lot of money in promoting content, just membership. So the only money that they really use in Google and in Facebook is to promote the membership to the project, not content. And now they are not suffering, or we are not suffering the same dependency as others, because once you start paying and promoting content, it's kind of hard to stop. So yeah, definitely there is some advantages, even though you could feel excluded sometimes and you need some push sometimes. But at least it's true that you arrive later to some experiments, or maybe you don't even arrive there, and that could be better for you.
Renée, your job title literally is essentially the question of this panel. You're head of new content strategies of the Financial Times. Take it away, head of into the future.
Over to me then, yeah. First of all, I think elements of everything that each of my other co-panelists have said are really, I think, universal truths as well, right? Even though we're all speaking from different kinds of business models, different media, different forms of distribution, the reality is that there is a kind of universality to the ways that any publisher has to relate to the platforms. So I sort of want to talk more generally about that relationship, and then afterwards just a little bit specifically about the Financial Times. And there's one thing I sort of want to call into question entirely, and that's the idea that this is a relationship. There's absolute asymmetry. And these platforms are part of our ecosystem. They're not really an option, right? I mean, they're structural realities, they're cultural realities, they're interfaces with everything for people now. It's not just content and information. It's sometimes people's connection to their social relationships. It's people's connection to their consumption and purchases. It's connection to conversation. These are not platforms anymore. They really are, in some ways, user experiences to like life. And we're deceiving ourselves, actually, if we think this is a negotiable relationship. This is not something, I think that Janine's analogy to a relationship is a good one, except this is a relationship that we can't really break up from, right? These platforms are now much too deeply imbricated in the lives of our users, no matter what your business model, and no matter how it is that you are relating to your readers or your viewers or your whatevers, we can't break up. So first, we do need to acknowledge that fundamental asymmetry. And I think there's something else we need to acknowledge, and that's it was something I was struck by Pierre Louette, who's the CEO of Les Echos, said this morning, and kind of defined Les Echos as the premier business publication in France, was talking about his relationship to the platforms as being sort of no hostility, no submission. That in itself is very adversarial, and I think for a long time, all of us, the Financial Times included to some extent, or certainly lots of people within us, had this notion of sort of demonizing the platforms, and again, I'm stealing someone else's thoughts, I think, from yesterday, Martin Moore, about how actually these platforms have done a lot to improve the lives, the distribution, the reach, the impact of our media, and in general, sort of lives of citizens. So there's a lot of good in this, but I guess what I'm saying is that we need to, delude ourselves, or rather sort of come back to reality. This is not a relationship. It's not symmetrical. It's not even codependent. It's a total asymmetry. And so we have to treat it as a negotiation. And I think when you when you're in a negotiation, it can be friendly, it can be diplomatic, but I think we need to remember that platforms do not need media. They're not thinking about journalism. Journalism is not only not their priority, it's like a distant, like way down the list of priorities. They are focusing on it, and there's lots of fruitful negotiation and conversations, and there's lots of interesting ways to collaborate, and we're all collaborating with them in different ways, but it is not their priority. And platforms, whether it's Google or Facebook or Apple, are creating products They're not creating products for publishers. They're creating products in which they're inviting publishers to participate, in which they're inviting publishers to perhaps try to retrofit and find a way to fit in if it could possibly be useful for them, but they're not prioritizing the needs of publishers. So what do we take away from that? Well, we can't break up, but at least we I think, are now much more realistic about the partner who is opposite us, right, at the negotiating table. And so now it's sort of coming a bit more specifically to the Financial Times. To some extent, because we are a subscription publication, we've always been a reader revenue publication, so we've never relied necessarily for viability or sustainability on platform traffic. It doesn't mean we don't get a tremendous benefit from it. So it does put us in a slightly different position where we can perhaps hold the line of what our priorities are. But I think that's sort of how I would like to think about a relationship to platforms, is that it's not adversarial, but it's on a negotiation basis. It's a reminding publishers of saying, look, what you're offering is kind of interesting, but what's in it for me? It's not for publishers, so what can a publisher get out of it? And what is the thing you need most before you're going to get into the game with them? As it happens, most of us need some form of monetization, right? And monetization doesn't have to be just revenue. It can be engagement. It can be some kind of measurably valuable traffic. But, in short, there's kind of a mantra at the Financial Times, which is, if I can measure it, I can monetize it. So the game is really, you really need to not do anything you can't measure. So as we think about how are we participating with new formats, new products, new collaborations, producing things that are optimized for certain specificities of certain platforms, what is the measurable benefit for my business model or for my audience or some measurable benefit that I can actually point to? And that isn't necessarily a successful way in, because there is always going to be some measure of codependence and some measure of asymmetry. But I think that if we're keeping in mind that this is a friendly, if somewhat ruthless negotiation, and that we really do need to keep in mind that if we're not keeping publishing priorities in mind, the platforms aren't, and it's not their job, and the market for the moment is not aligned to make that be their job.
That was a dose of reality. Thanks very much, Renée. I mean, I suppose there are some things here I can already now see as some sort of emerging takeaways from what people have said that I think may be just worth quickly recapping. And maybe for those of you who may have received, one of those 2 a.m. emails from a senior colleague, often a man in his early 60s, asking, what's our TikTok strategy? Or, are we on Snapchat, ? After they've read something in DigiDay or Nieman Lab or spoken to one of their buddies. Maybe the response is, as Renée just reminded us, what's in it for us? Like, what are we trying to achieve? And I think there's been quite a number of publishers who probably haven't been very clear about what it was they were trying to achieve. And when faced with the fear of missing out, there was a little bit of a tendency to not experiment, because in an experiment you have an hypothesis, and you are trying to test whether this hypothesis is in fact true or not, or in the case of strategy, useful or not useful. So not experimenting, but just messing around. And I suppose there are not many publishers who want to be just messing around for too long anymore. So I think we have some things we can identify. So Renée gave us the sort of key question, what are you trying to achieve? And clarity about goals. Blathnaid, you talked about this too in some ways, talked about the evaluation, if you will, sort of constantly trying to assess, are we in fact achieving what we are trying to do with a given platform? And it came through very clearly from what you said, that this is not about, at the level of the company, this is an individual product or service from a platform company. It's not about, is all of Google working for us, but it's one specific relationship, if I can still use that term, after Renée's observations, working out to our advantage. You also suggested learning, which I thought Maria was interesting too, and these sort of different kinds of collaborations that can be about other things than reach or revenue, but can be about things like pursuing an editorial mission. Like Clara is here, who's working on these issues around misinformation in Spain, so perhaps she may have observations later. And then I think Janine, with your experience in BuzzFeed and elsewhere, just a sort of a move from enthusiastic collaboration and everything to a bit more caution, a bit more sort of selective engagement. So I suppose in some ways we started with your observation too, being about what are we trying to achieve. I wanted to just quickly test two things with you before we open up. One is, I come across the term Facebook apocalypse very often. often accompanied by sort of a nuclear sort of mushroom cloud and superimposed face of Mark Zuckerberg. And I just wonder whether any of you will volunteer any views on whether this kind of terminology is useful in informing decision making in news organizations, and whether this terminology is sort of captures the consequences of product decisions made by platform companies. Are these things, in fact, sort of apocalyptic interventions that are somewhere in between nuclear holocaust and acts of God in terms of their consequences for publishers? Sometimes they may be. I mean, there are, Upworthy and others have really suffered in some instances. Demand Media really suffered with the Panda update to Google many years ago. Or how do we think about these structural changes that come out of Silicon Valley once in a while?
I can speak a little bit to that. You know, as a publication that was absolutely not dependent on Facebook for any kind of revenue. So, you know, when, like everyone else, you know, last January, February, sort of a year and some months ago, not this most recent one, you know, with a famous sort of shift in the Facebook algorithm, like everyone else, sure, we experienced a dip in Facebook traffic. And I think, again, because of the nature of our business model and of what our objectives were, there was regret and there was a sense of reflection and even sort of perplexity. But to be terribly honest, the perplexity, again, because we're fortunate enough for it not to sort of have affected our bottom line or our viability, we're left in this sort of perplexing situation of asking, well, actually, what are we getting out of Facebook? What is useful for it? I mean, you know, it wasn't a total cratering, but it was a pretty big dip. So it suddenly made us reevaluate, actually. Well, we've been sort of de facto kind of reflexively thinking we have to be in Facebook because it's a way to reach and grow, and we have to create these sort of Facebook-friendly content and optimize for the kind of engagement that's there and sort of rethink even the whole metrics of what's valuable, because we're certainly not getting subscriptions from Facebook. So it suddenly made us realize, well, why are we in it at all? And we're still in it, and we still have a social media team, and it's still actually quite a useful way to reach and to grow and to do lots of things that are frankly difficult to measure, but nonetheless we're in it. But I think in some ways it was almost a wake-up call to sort of take a really gimlet-eyed look at, again, if we're at risk of fearing an impact on our viability, then first of all, how much do we really need them? And let's minimize any kind of dependence on them. And what does that look like concretely? Can we even, and I'll be honest, we sort of suddenly began to think, well, do we need to be posting as much as we're posting? You know, we have X number of resources dedicated to doing this, and we're posting X number of posts daily. Can we reduce and see if it changes anything? Much like many publishers, we contractually were in an agreement with Facebook, and we got paid to do Facebook Lives, and we earned lots of revenue, and we did lots of Facebook Lives, and it actually didn't do very much for our audience and wasn't particularly editorially relevant, complete full honesty. It was a revenue play that we chose not to renew. Actually, frankly, Facebook chose not to renew that. But it was, these were all interesting experiments that almost pointed to a kind of futility, and that I think was very helpful in the end.
Helpful futility, that's my favorite kind of futility. Maria, you wanted to get into this too?
It also, just following up a bit on what Renée is saying, it also makes you think about other platforms, because it's true that Facebook is mainly the one that we're always thinking about because it's so big, so global, but maybe for the purpose you're trying to achieve, another platform could be more useful. And in the case of El Diario, for instance, a couple of years ago, there was a new Telegram channel. Telegram, which is the equivalent of WhatsApp, more or less, but it's open. You can actually build things there. It's very popular in Spain about political junkies, because there's a couple of new or newer political parties that started using Telegram. So El Diario started this channel, sending sort of digest of news a couple of times a day. And it's really growing and working, and it has given us like another way to engage people that seems to be more loyal, so they become more easily members of El Diario. And it's small, it's very small compared to Facebook, but it gives us more. So the fact that there was this crisis, I think, in the case of El Diario, but also in many other news outlets, make us also look around, like, well, maybe other platforms are also useful for other purposes.
The Peter Baelish approach to platform strategy, a crisis is a ladder. I wonder whether we could maybe turn from that to another thing I just wanted to hear any thoughts on before we open up for questions or comments from the people who've joined us today. We talk a lot, as we should, about the relationship or the interactions between platforms and publishers. I just wonder whether any of you have any thoughts on what, if anything, publishers can make of the relationship between platforms. And what I mean by that is that, you know, at an event like this, we focus a lot on the competition between publishers and platforms, but I think we perhaps should keep in mind sometimes that they are competing amongst themselves, right? In what Eric Schmidt once evocatively termed the platform wars. And I just wonder whether any of you have thoughts on whether there are opportunities in that crisis, or whatever you want to call it, for publishers.
You can break up with platforms. You can, in the sense that you can look at it and go, I am not going to engage with YouTube, I am going to engage with Facebook Live, which we all did for a year because they all paid us to do it, as we've all confessed with great regret. And then YouTube will probably come back and say, oh, do you know, we'd love to work with you on a couple of things, because everybody worked with Facebook, and we did not, we weren't the platform darling of Snapchat in the UK, which was extraordinary because BuzzFeed was huge with Snapchat in the US, but we looked at it, we didn't feel that we had the resource to remake everything for Snapchat Discover. There wasn't that much additive revenue for, you know, we just decided to sit back. And I think probably quite a lot of other people did, because The Telegraph was the launch partner for Snapchat in the UK, and I just don't think that was an instinctive demographic fit, so I'm guessing a couple of people might have said no, as well as us, for very similar reasons, because these things are intensive. And it is also true that, I know my laboured and tortuous dating analogy, but you know, the more you sort of say no to something, the more something else, or you start dating someone else and someone looks more interested. That platforms do a bit of that. I'm sorry, publishers do a bit of that, and they should sort of do a bit more. I think you know, I watched Mark Thompson at the Oxford a couple of weeks ago sit there and rather confidently say, yeah, no, we're not playing with Apple News Plus. And I think it was the Wall Street Journal, was it? And again, you look at that and think, they didn't go to Wall Street Journal first. I mean, I might be wrong, I wasn't in the room, but I don't believe they would have done. They would have gone to the New York Times, they would have gone to the Washington Post. You know who all the Apple key partners are and who they go to. And some of those people have looked at it and gone, no, I'm not going to play. That, I think, is a really interesting thing when you see the platform darling lineup change for product launch. That is a publisher exercising power.
It's a really interesting time that is, though, coming for platforms. I mean, you know, I think Renée alluded to it earlier with Apple Plus. I mean, this is about them figuring out the next phase of what Apple is, the services business. You know, this is about them reinventing their business model. And I think, you know, if we also look then at the big players, the Facebooks, Twitter, I mean, they are in that phase now where they're in their second decade. It's getting trickier. You're responding more and more to, you know, newer platforms popping up. Something like Snapchat comes up and you're overhauling what you're doing because you're trying to, you know, compete with that and get the under 25s and stay relevant to those younger audiences. And then what I think is probably most interesting then is this, you know, it's not just about Silicon Valley and what comes out of there anymore. You know, you see something like TikTok, which is incredibly addictive, and it's got, you know, really big download rates, and it's, you know, it's coming from China, and it has this big global footprint already, and its barrier to entry is probably lower than Twitter was when it first set up in terms of when you open an account. It's crystal clear what you do with it. It's not like, you know, with other platforms where you had to sort of figure it out and find your audience there. It's, you know, the sort of the from 0 to 100 is very easy with it. So I think that there are interesting times coming for the platforms and how they're going to be reshaped. And I think that shaping is going to come from the new challengers, as it always has done. I mean, you know, Facebook has been responsive over the years. Twitter has been responsive over the years. Apple continues to be responsive. So that's, you know, that is certainly going to be a thing to watch.
The word responsive, I think, is a moment where I should turn around and ask whether there are any questions or comments from the floor. So raise your hand and please introduce yourself and direct the question ideally to one of the panelists. So please.
Hello, I'm Florian Stambula from Austrian publisher Der Standard. I'm wondering, because you presented some numbers on news discovery at the beginning, and I think that one could argue that this is only going to be more integrated into the hardware component, into the platforms in the future. And we already see this with Apple and with Samsung, where you don't even have to go to a social platform anymore to discover news. So I'm wondering if you agree with this assumption that you have to be a part of this to stay relevant, and if so, what strategies you deploy, or how do you see this play out in the future?
Anyone got any strategies?
No. So this is about, you're talking about the actual, like the devices that are leading the way, and how it's the devices, and then it's baked into, as in Apple News is on the lock screen and Google News.
For example, Apple News, or like what's already there, and Apple News Plus as well. It's on your iPhone already. You probably have it in the future subsidized by your carrier company, so you don't even have to pay for it.
Well, for us, I mean, it's about global, right? Because Apple is part of the market, but then for us, you know, massive part of it when we think about our international audiences is Android and sort of the various routes to product. So from our, I suppose, perspective, we're always looking at what are the international ways to get to the various segments of the market, and if that's, you know, in APAC, that means for us it's engaging with Line, you know, and alerting directly through a platform like that. In the US, it's engaging with Apple News with more enthusiasm. So, you know, for things like Apple News right now, when I think about it internationally, it's two international markets. It's the UK and it's Australia. So, you know, it's a part of it, but it's a pretty small part of the big globe that we're trying to figure out right now.
I mean, maybe just very quickly, I think it's very clear that platforms fundamentally succeed by taking friction out of interactions, right? I mean, that's the central value proposition. And in that game, pre-installs and defaults are incredibly important. And I think a lot of publishers right now are thinking about, can they get onto the default of the things that they know are going to be pre-installed on tens or hundreds of millions of handsets around the world. So that is sort of the platform and publisher calculation. In parallel with that, it's worth remembering that there is a policy dimension to this, which is, of course, from the point of view of regulators, pre-installs and defaults can be seen as being potentially anti-competitive. And this goes back all the way back to the European Union going after Microsoft and requiring that Microsoft, when bundling in browsers with the Windows operating system, had to give the user on the first start a choice. Which browser of these do you want, with no box pre-checked? So there is sort of a second dimension of this that's about what policymakers want to do, if anything, to prevent platforms from taking friction out of interactions in ways that they think benefit end users and, of course, themselves and their shareholders. Other questions?
It's really impressive that we got 50 minutes into a panel about publishers and platforms. We just mentioned regulation.
Also, if I may add to your question, you have to think more in practical terms also about the individual single article and where your brand is and where are the links and what do you want, like the reader to see. In Spain, it's very popular now, this application that comes with Samsung from Axel Springer, Update. I don't know if you have it in Austria too. And we're getting high traffic from that app, that they have like an editorial curation, and sometimes they feature very prominently your article and you really notice the impact. But we realized that we haven't really thought about really building something else or something more into the article that they get. So it's so simple that people get back to the home and don't see anything else from El Diario. So now we're starting to think, well, we should build more easily, like just link stories and just to make the reader maybe go to someplace else in our website, not just in Update.
And just to add a little piece of answering your question and to the platform wars question that Rasmus brought up. I mean, look, Apple has not made it at all interesting for publishers with any kind of revenue business to be part of that. So that means that as of now, like day zero in the launch of Apple News, or the relaunch of Apple News, that probably is announcing in any number of newsrooms across the world, what is the workaround plan? What is our strategy for optimizing other platforms? As Blathnaid points out, like Apple is actually a relatively small portion of the global audience. As it happens, it's probably a pretty big proportion of the somewhat more premium global elite audience that are the subscribers of the Financial Times, but that doesn't mean that there aren't other ways of access, and frankly other routes into the Apple universe via which we can be engaging with readers, who indeed will have to find strategies to ask them to come back to our platform. But there is a way in which it's not a total monopoly, it's actually a sort of oligopoly, but there are opportunities for publishers in that, I think.
There's a microphone.
I don't have like a clear question. It's just because, yeah, right. I mean, so many minutes of publishers and platforms, but what about regulation? Because also in these whole days we have spoken people have spoken so much about regulation. So maybe any comments from your side on that?
Hurrah. I think it's a really interesting moment for that balance of power between publishers and platforms, because the platforms finally know that regulation is imminent and upon them. This time last year we were all talking about whether there was the possibility of regulation. Now we absolutely know that the platforms are all going to get regulated, and it does mean that two groups that feel particularly victimised, or that their power has been taken away by platforms, which are media and politicians, both of whom are accustomed to having quite a lot of ungoverned power, have a moment to turn around and take some of it back. And I think that's a big game now for the next few months and possibly even years, as politicians and the media have a look at the public discourse around platforms, their opportunity to take back some power and some money, and start to chip away. That's why it's really the only motivation that the platforms have now to play nicely. They're so dominant, they have so much revenue, they would have no reason to even come and sponsor our party or be at our conference, other than the fear of what happens. Yeah, and Rasmus is completely right to point to Microsoft. That the unpicking of Microsoft by the European, what do they call it then? I can't remember. DG14, I think it was, is what they're all terrified of. So it is a lever that we must use, I think.
I mean, I'll just add a couple of things on this. I think there's no question that there is a need for regulation. There's no question that there is a momentum for regulation as well that will result in regulation. And I think there are a number of issues on which I'm cautiously hopeful that we will see forms of regulation that are, broadly speaking, good for society, in the sense that they foster competition, that they foster various forms of interoperability and data portability that allow new entrants to compete with incumbents in the platform space, and that may enhance intelligibility so that citizens are capable of understanding at least the basic operations of the infrastructures that they rely upon. I'm less optimistic about whether any of these things will necessarily benefit publishers unless the regulations are explicitly designed as incumbency protection, which is possible. There are some who sort of quite unashamedly promote this as sort of a way of clawing back money that they seem to think somehow naturally belong to publishers. I think the thing that's sometimes missing from that conversation are the observations I made at this beginning, which is that it's audiences and advertisers who left publishers first, because platforms solve their problems better. That we are the ones who are voting with our feet, and the advertisers are trying to buy our attention, and that's why they're following to the platforms. And then there will be a scandal, and then Unilever will say, we'll pull our advertising, and then Facebook will post another quarter of blockbuster growth.
That's entirely correct, isn't it? They shouldn't be regulating businesses.
I completely agree. I completely agree that the purpose of competition law is to protect competition. It's not to protect competitors. But I don't think we have any strong reason to believe that that will necessarily benefit publishers. So I think there will be intervention in this space, but I'm not sure it's going to benefit publishers necessarily. And I think that's just sort of quite important to keep in mind, as important as this is, as urgent as it is to address, that, take an example. This is just to give an example of this. there is a call to break up Facebook, okay? Let's take that. Let's just remind ourselves, it's not so long ago, what would that mean? That would take us back to the halcyon days of 2012, before the acquisition of Instagram and WhatsApp by Facebook, where publishers were losing money hand over fist in digital and had no business model, right? I mean, what exactly is it about something like that we would expect to help publishers? There's nothing in that necessarily. That would help Amazon, that's for sure. It would help, probably help Apple. It might help TikTok enter the market. It might help new platform companies compete with Facebook, and that I think is quite good, to have stronger competition in this oligopoly. But whether it would help publishers, I think, is a separate question, and I'm not particularly encouraged that there are any models on the table right now that do not pick winners or protect incumbents, but in fact benefit the publishers. I'm being told by the staff that they'll decapitate me if I don't stop now. So we should thank the staff. They're working very hard, and the volunteers to make all this happen. Thanks all of you for coming out for this and for the conversation, and thanks in particular to the panelists. Thank you very much.